"You filthy fraud. You think that costume means anything to me." The handcuffs clicked shut at pump number 4 of Buckhorn Feed and Fuel at 7:52 on a Tuesday morning, and the sound carried across the lot the way sounds carry in flat West Texas, clean and hard and further than it should, swallowed eventually by the dry air and the distant moan of a freight truck on Route 9 that didn't slow down and didn't look over. Commander Darius Reed's cheek pressed against the hood of a silver rental car, the metal already burning from the morning sun, and he did not make a sound. Not because he had no options. He had counted 4 of them in the first 2 seconds after the deputy's hand moved toward his holster. But because the man who had taught him everything he knew about restraint was lying in a box at Oak Ridge Cemetery, and Darius Reed was going to that funeral with his uniform clean and his honor intact, regardless of what it cost him to get there. The uniform told its story to anyone who had ever learned the language of it. Navy dress blues pressed the night before with the same deliberate care he gave a pre-mission equipment check, the gold trident of the seals above his heart, and just below it, a ribbon that most people in Deer Lick County, Texas had never seen in person, the pale blue field. The small white stars, the constellation of a life spent entirely in service to something larger than itself. Deputy Cole Hargrove stood behind him with one hand on the cuffs he had fastened deliberately tight and the other hooked into his belt, and the smirk on his face was the smirk of a man who has just won something, though he couldn't have said precisely what, and he had no idea that somewhere in a concrete box at the back of his own station, the man he'd arrested was already planning the only phone call that would matter before the morning was over. Deer Lick County, West Texas had the particular atmosphere of a place that used to be something and had spent 3 decades in the slow and quiet business of forgetting it, one boarded window and one faded sign at a time, with the patient resignation of a town that had learned to call decline by a gentler name. The main street had 4 businesses still open and 6 with brown paper over the glass, their interiors visible in pale outlines through the cracks. Sun-bleached and still, and the water tower at the edge of town still bore the county name in letters that had been losing their color since before most of the deputies at the sheriff's station had been hired, the paint going, not all at once, but incrementally, the way things go when no one decides to stop them. Buckhorn Feed and Fuel sat at the junction of State Route 9 and the county road that ran south toward the border 40 miles from the nearest competitor, which made it indispensable to everyone who passed through and made its owner quietly beholden to anyone with the inclination to make his life difficult. And the pumps were old, and the canopy overhead had a section of sheet metal that rattled in any wind above 15 miles an hour. And the cooler inside stocked beer alongside motor oil and phone chargers, with the cheerful and unapologetic pragmatism of a place that understood exactly what its customers needed. Darius had pulled in just after 7:30, the rental running low after 4 hours of flat highway from San Antonio, the landscape shifting from pale scrubland to harder and drier scrubland without offering anything different to look at. And he had fueled up in quiet, watching the numbers climb on the old pump face the morning already thick with heat that had no intention of relenting. He almost didn't notice the tanker truck parked at the far edge of the lot, engine off, no driver visible anywhere near it. But the detail his brain quietly flagged without making a production of it was the license plate muddy and partially covered, and the state registration sticker sitting in the wrong position for a Texas commercial vehicle, a small thing, the kind of thing most people drive past without their eyes catching it. But Darius logged it and looked back at the pump. Across the gravel lot, through the window of a small diner that shared the property's edge, a woman named Rosa Garland was pulling chairs off tabletops to start her morning, and she glanced out at the pump without any particular reason and saw the man in the Navy uniform standing alone in the early heat, and something about the way he stood made her pause for just a moment before she went back to her chairs. Cole Hargrove had been 19 years old when the Army recruiting sergeant in Midland told him with what sounded like genuine apology that the heart murmur he hadn't known about was a disqualifying condition, that there were other ways to serve, that it wasn't a reflection of his character or his potential. And Hargrove had stopped listening somewhere around the word disqualifying and had driven back to Deerlick County that afternoon in a silence so complete that the radio stayed off for all 80 miles. And somewhere on that empty highway, something shifted in him, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a bone shifts when it doesn't heal quite right, so that years later the ache is constant and the person carrying it has long since stopped remembering what it felt like before. The military had looked at Cole Hargrove and found him insufficient, and that was the truth he had lived with for 19 years, and the way he had chosen to live with it was to make absolutely certain that no one within the reach of his badge ever got to feel sufficient either, especially not the men who wore the uniforms he had been told he would never earn. His father had gotten him on with the Deerlick County Sheriff's Department 6 months after the rejection. Third generation, the grandfather's badge framed above the fireplace on Caldwell Road and Hargrove, had grown up understanding that the badge was not a career, but an identity. The thing that answered the question of who you were when nothing else provided an answer, and 12 years on the force had not changed. That understanding, they had deepened it. He had never been formally disciplined, not because the reasons hadn't existed, but because Sheriff Dale Pruitt had spent 12 years making sure that no reason ever became a record, and the town had a quiet name for what happened when Hargrove decided someone was a problem. They called it the exit interview. And the exit interview ended one of two ways. Either you left the county quietly of your own accord, or you found yourself in cell 3 with charges that somehow always managed to stick, and either way, the problem was resolved, and Pruitt's operation continued without friction. The men in uniform were the ones Hargrove hated with a specificity he had never examined closely enough to understand. He knew only that when he saw dress blues or combat fatigues, something moved through him that was hot and quiet and needed somewhere to go. Something he would have called contempt if anyone had pressed him on it. But what it actually was much simpler and much sadder than contempt. It was envy wearing contempt's clothes, and it had been wearing those clothes for so long that Hargrove himself could no longer tell the difference. In the passenger seat of the cruiser, rolling slowly toward Buckhorn's lot, Rookie Deputy Pete Lowe sat very still with his eyes moving between the figure at the pump and Hargrove's face, and in his expression was the look of a young man who already understands that this is going to go wrong and has not yet found the courage to say so out loud. Dale Pruitt was 57 years old and had been the most powerful man in Deerlick County for so long that the distinction between what the county needed and what he personally wanted had ceased to exist in any practical sense, the two things having merged gradually and completely over the course of 3 decades, until he could no longer see the seam between them. He had been a running back in high school, 2 district championships. His name still on the trophy case in the gymnasium of a school that had been underfunded for 15 years and 3 decades later. He still moved through rooms with the unconscious expectation that spaces would make themselves available to him. And they generally did, because in Deerlick County there was no one positioned to tell him otherwise. The county was dying economically and had been for 20 years. The oil money was long gone. The young people were leaving with the thoroughness of people who have stopped believing. A place has anything left to offer them. The tax base. Hollowing out the way, structures hollow out, when the thing holding them together quietly disappears. And Pruitt's response had been neither grief nor any genuine attempt at revitalization, but something more practical and considerably more dangerous, which was adaptation. Deerlick County sat on a back road corridor 40 miles north of the border, the kind of route that didn't appear on federal surveillance maps as significant, which made it to the right kind of business partner extremely valuable, and Pruitt had those partners had cultivated them over 3 years, with the patience of a man who understood that the most durable arrangements are the ones nobody is looking for. Buckhorn Feed and Fuel, which he quietly co-owned through a shell company registered in an adjacent county, was where the arrangement was serviced. Hargrove was his eyes on the road, his enforcer on the lot, and the reason the whole thing had stayed intact this long, and everything had been running smoothly, efficiently, invisibly. Right up until the morning, a man in navy dress blue stopped to fill a rental tank at pump number 4. Darius Reed had a way of standing that people noticed without being able to name precisely what they were noticing. A quality of stillness that didn't read as passivity, but as something closer to readiness. The posture of a man who has been in enough situations where the difference between living and not living came down entirely to the quality of his attention, and who had learned that the body that holds itself quietly is the body that moves first when it has to. He was 44 years old and looked at the way a well-maintained aircraft looks its hours, every mile of service visible. Nothing worn past its tolerance, nothing decorative about any of it. The ribbon rack on his chest told a compressed story to anyone who had ever learned to read that particular language. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor Purple Heart, Navy Cross, and at the top the pale blue field with its small white stars, the one that civilians sometimes recognized on sight even when they couldn't immediately name it, the Medal of Honor awarded for a night in Kunar Province when Darius had pulled 3 men from a burning structure under direct enemy fire, had taken a round through his left hand, had refused evacuation twice, and had not stopped moving until every one of his people was accounted for. He was driving to a funeral. Master Chief Petty Officer Raymond Cole, United States Navy SEAL, retired, had died of a stroke on a Tuesday, which Darius had always thought was a particularly undignified day of the week for a man who had been that large and that certain in the world. And Cole's daughter had called him at the Pentagon, and Darius had stood in a corridor with the phone at his ear for a long moment after she hung up, waiting to find out what was still solid. He had flown commercial to San Antonio, rented the car, driven 4 hours through hard flat country, without the radio on, wanting the quiet. Thinking about cold Virginia wind, and a class of 11 men standing in a row, and Raymond Cole's hands, which had been steady the morning he pinned the trident to Darius's chest at the end of Hell Week, and the thing Cole had said quietly that Darius had carried for 22 years like a compass bearing. You earned it. Don't waste it. And when the tanker truck had registered in his peripheral vision and his brain had quietly flagged the plate and the sticker and the absent driver, he had logged it the way he logged everything that didn't fit the expected pattern, without drama, without urgency, as simple information waiting for context. He had capped the tank and turned toward the store to pay when the sound of gravel shifting under tires made him look up. Not because he was startled, but because his body had been cataloging the sounds of this lot since the moment he'd arrived. And this one was new, the county cruiser rolling in slow lights off parking at an angle that blocked both exit lanes with the ease of long practice, and he watched Deputy Cole Hargrove step out into the morning sun, adjust his sunglasses, hook his thumbs in his belt, and let his gaze settle on the dress blues with an expression that lasted only a second but said everything Darius needed to know about how the next few minutes were going to go. Hargrove crossed the lot with the deliberate heel-heavy walk of a man performing ownership, the stride that announces itself, that expects the space to acknowledge the approach, his utility belt creaking with each step, his whole bearing constructed to ensure that whoever he was approaching felt the weight of what was coming toward them. He stopped 2 feet from Darius, with his sunglasses still on in the morning light, and looked the uniform up and down with a slow and exaggerated theatricality designed to communicate disbelief. And what it communicated instead was something more specific and more honest. The expression of a man who resents what he's looking at, and has already decided what he intends to do about it, not because he has a reason, but because having a reason has stopped being a requirement. "Mighty fancy costume you got on there," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who has delivered a line so many times it no longer costs him anything to say it. "Halloween come early this year." Darius responded the way he responded to everything that required no elaboration, with plain facts delivered in the register he used in briefing rooms, which was deep and unhurried and utterly without apology. He was a commander in the United States Navy. He was heading to a funeral in Oak Ridge, and he would appreciate being allowed to pay for his fuel. Hargrove let out a short, sharp bark of laughter, glanced back at Lowe in the cruiser, then turned and began circling Darius the way you circle something you've already decided you own, stopping finally close enough that Darius could smell stale tobacco and peppermint gum and the specific sourness of a man who runs on processed food and unchecked certainty. Hargrove raised his hand toward the ribbons not quickly, but with the leisurely confidence of a man reaching for something on a shelf in his own house, and Darius's hand moved first. No wind-up, no telegraphing, just a grip around Hargrove's wrist that was suddenly there, immovable and patient as structural steel, and Hargrove stopped with a physical jolt like a man who has walked into a wall he didn't see coming. "Do not touch the uniform," Darius said, and the words came out flat and absolute in the morning heat. The voice of a man who has not needed volume to be heard in 22 years, and he released the wrist. Hargrove yanked his hand back, his face going dark, his palm dropping instinctively to the grip of his service weapon, and Darius offered his military ID, and Hargrove waved it away without looking at it. And Darius gave the name and direct line of his commanding officer, and Hargrove talked over him. And Darius offered 2 separate phone numbers that would have resolved the entire situation in under 5 minutes. And Hargrove refused both of them with the escalating dismissal of someone who understands, on some level, that the information would end the performance, and the performance was not something Hargrove was prepared to give up. Hargrove unclipped his radio and called it in stolen valor assault on an officer, his voice ringing across the hot concrete with the theatrical confidence of a man performing for an audience he is always assumed will applaud. The handcuffs went on tight, not officer tight, message tight. The metal biting into skin with a practiced precision that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with making a point. And as Hargrove walked Darius to the cruiser, Darius said quietly, his voice carrying no heat and no desperation, only the steady tone of a man making an accurate observation about the near future. "You're going to regret this, Deputy." In the window of her small diner, Rosa Garland had gone completely still, her hand already on her phone, watching the man in the Medal of Honor uniform being pressed against the hood of a rental car with a deputy's hand on the back of his neck, and her thumb hovered over the camera icon, while something tightened in her chest. She had reported things before and been called a troublemaker for. It had been told to mind her business, had been made to feel small for believing what she saw with her own eyes. And she stood there in that particular hesitation that belongs to people who have learned that speaking up carries a cost. While through the glass the handcuffs clicked shut and the deputy smiled. As the cruiser door closed behind him, Darius looked through the side window at the lot one last time, and the tanker had moved. It was backed up now against the underground fill hatch at the far corner of the property, and 2 men in work clothes were moving around it with the focused clockwork efficiency of people operating on a schedule that had no margin built into it. Not the loose conversational rhythm of a routine delivery, but the concentrated precision of people who have counted their minutes and intend to use every one of them. One of the men glanced toward the cruiser as it began to pull out, and Darius held the look through the glass for exactly half a second, then closed his eyes and settled back against the cage, letting the information take its place, alongside everything else he had been collecting since the moment he'd turned off the highway into this lot, filing it quietly in the part of his mind that cataloged things that didn't fit. In the passenger seat, Pete Lowe's eyes kept finding the rearview mirror and then looking away, and in his face was not Hargrove's contempt, but something considerably more uncomfortable, the expression of a young man beginning to understand what he has allowed himself to become a part of. Hargrove drove the way certain men drive when they have a captive audience, aggressively, with deliberate hard braking at the last second and turns taken faster than the road required, each one sending Darius into the cage divider with a sharp impact that Hargrove absorbed in his shoulders without turning around. A very old technique with a very simple logic: make the body uncomfortable and the mind will follow it. Worked on approximately everyone who hadn't spent a week in SERE school, being taught exactly how the technique worked and precisely why. So Darius sat perfectly still in the back and memorized things. Instead, badge number 214 on Hargrove's chest, badge number 219 on Lowe, direction of travel northwest on County Road, 9 time of arrest, 7:52 a.m., the particular creak of the left rear shock absorber every time the road dipped. Lowe spoke quietly, almost to himself, staring at the windshield. "That ribbon rack. I think that's a silver star. And that I think that's the Medal of Honor." "Shut it, Pete." Hargrove's voice was flat and final. A pause, and then Hargrove launched into the stolen valor speech with the genuine feeling of a man who has told himself this particular story so many times that it has become indistinguishable from personal conviction. The contempt for people who wanted the respect without a single day of real sacrifice. The physical disgust it produced in him. The righteous clarity of knowing who the real frauds were. And in the back seat, Darius opened his eyes and looked at the passing scrubland through the window and felt nothing about what was being said, because it occupied a drawer in his mind labeled irrelevant, and he had learned a long time ago not to open that drawer when there was still work to do. The Deer Lick County Sheriff's Station was a squat brick building that smelled of mildew and industrial floor cleaner, and the specific staleness of a place where the windows hadn't been opened since a previous administration, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with the inconsistency of fixtures several years overdue for replacement. And Booking Sergeant Doyle looked up from his lunch when Hargrove brought Darius through the back entrance with a hand on his collar that gathered the fabric of the dress jacket and crumpled it. "What you got?" Doyle asked. "Stolen valor," Hargrove said, loud enough for the officers at the far desk to hear with the satisfaction of a man presenting evidence of a theory he has just been vindicated on. "Guy thinks he's a Navy SEAL." Doyle looked at the uniform without any particular expression and went back to his lunch. The processing room was tiled walls, one overhead bulb, old sweat and industrial soap, and Hargrove ordered the jacket off, and Darius removed it carefully, folding it with the limited space the room allowed, and Hargrove snatched it mid-fold and dropped it into the plastic evidence bin. And then he found the trident. He picked the jacket back up and turned it over slowly in his hands, and Darius could see him searching for something specific, and when his eyes found the gold trident pin above the breast pocket, they stopped there, and the expression that moved across Hargrove's face in that moment was not contempt. It was something that lived underneath contempt. Something raw and considerably older. The look of a 19-year-old boy sitting in a Midland recruiting office, hearing a word he had never once imagined would be applied to himself. Hargrove unclipped the pocket knife from his belt. "Don't." The single word landed in the tiled room with a weight that made even Doyle pause mid-chew, and Hargrove looked at Darius with his jaw tight and something bright and ugly moving behind his eyes. And then he worked the tip of the knife under the threading of the trident pin with slow and deliberate care. And Darius understood in that moment that this was not vandalism. It wasn't even cruelty for its own sake. This was Hargrove answering a question he had been living inside for 19 years. The question that went, "If I can take this from you, then it was never as real as you believed it was. And if it was never real, then the thing that kept me from having it was nothing, and I have been carrying nothing for 19 years for no reason at all." The trident hit the dirty floor with a small, clear metallic sound that seemed to fill the room the way small sounds fill rooms when everything else has gone completely still. "Oops," Hargrove said, and his voice was entirely flat. No pleasure in it, just the hollow sound of a man who has done the thing he wanted to do, and discovered that it didn't fix what he thought it would fix, that the floor where the pin landed was exactly as empty as it was before. "Run my fingerprints," Darius said very quietly, looking at Hargrove with the steadiness of a man who has already begun the next calculation. "Look up my name in the federal database. Call Naval Special Warfare Command. You have one chance to correct this before it becomes something that cannot be corrected." Hargrove told Lowe to book him and put him in cell 3 and turned his back. Pete Lowe stood alone in the processing room with the trident pin on the floor in front of him, and he crouched down and picked it up and turned it over in his palm, and it was heavy and solid in the way that cheap metal simply cannot replicate. And the gold had a depth that belonged to something built to last a long time through difficult conditions, and he set it carefully on the counter rather than leaving it where it had fallen. And when he glanced at Darius being led away, he mouthed a single word that cost him something to produce, and Darius saw it and filed it away in a different drawer than the one labeled irrelevant. Cell 3 was 8 by 10 concrete with a metal bench bolted to the wall, a broken air conditioning unit that produced noise without producing any actual cooling, and a temperature that sat in the space between uncomfortable and genuinely punishing. And Darius sat on the bench with his spine straight and his hands folded in his lap and his eyes closed, and he did not pace, and he did not shout, because both of those options were available to him, and neither of them would move the situation forward by a single inch. And he had learned a long time ago, in places considerably more hostile than this, that the man who preserves himself during captivity is the man who still has something left to spend when the door finally opens. He listened to the station the way he had been trained to listen to environments, cataloging, sorting, filing. Hargrove's laugh, drifting from the bullpen, loose and comfortable. The laugh of a man who believes he has already won something. The crackle of the dispatch radio. The clang of the shift change sometime around noon. A brief argument near the coffee machine that ended without resolution. He thought about Raymond Cole's hands in the cold Virginia wind, and about the trident pin on the dirty processing room floor, and about the gold scratch the knife had left in it, and he thought about the tanker backed against the fill hatch at the far corner of the Buckhorn lot, and the two men moving around it with the precision of a rehearsed operation, and he let the information arrange itself into the shape it was already taking. Across the property at her small diner, Rosa Garland sat in a chair she hadn't moved from since watching the cruiser pull away. The photograph still on her phone's screen. The man in the Medal of Honor uniform pressed against the hood of a rental car, while the deputy stood behind him with his hand on the cuffs, and that particular expression that Rosa had been seeing her entire life on the faces of men who had been given authority over people they had already decided didn't deserve it, and she had reported things before, and the reporting had cost her, and changed nothing. And she turned the phone face down on the table and looked out the window at the empty lot where the tanker truck had been. And then she turned the phone back over and looked at the photograph again for a long time. At approximately 8:30 that evening, Deputy Cole Hargrove and Sheriff Dale Pruitt sat across from each other in a corner booth at Rosie's Diner on 4th Street, which served the best chicken fried steak in the county, and had the additional advantage of being owned by a man who owed Pruitt enough favors that certain conversations could happen there, without anyone who mattered ever knowing they had occurred. Hargrove was in good spirits, the particular looseness of a man who has had a satisfying day and expects the next one to be equally uncomplicated, and he told Pruitt about the tanker coming in clean 2 hours after the cruiser left the lot. No complications. Everything exactly as planned. And Pruitt cut his steak without looking up and asked whether he had run the fingerprints yet. Hargrove waved a hand. The machine had been acting up. He'd get it done before the arraignment in the morning, give the judge something to start his day with a laugh, and Pruitt nodded slowly. The nod of a man who has operated without meaningful consequence for so long that caution has stopped presenting itself as a necessary consideration, and told him there was another run scheduled for Thursday, and he needed Hargrove sharp. "Always am," Hargrove said, and leaned back in the booth with the comfortable expansiveness of a man who owns the room he's sitting in, which in this town he effectively did. And the iced coffee was cold in his hand, and the diner was warm and familiar around him, and he had not the faintest idea that this was the last evening of his life that would look anything like this. With Hargrove at dinner, Pete Lowe came to the cell door and stood in the frame looking pale and said quietly, without meeting Darius's eyes, that the sergeant had said he could make his call, and led him to the wall-mounted phone in the corridor and told him he had 5 minutes and local calls only, and then stood back. Darius picked up the receiver and dialed from memory. Not a lawyer, not family, not anyone whose involvement would resolve what needed to be resolved, but a number he kept alongside a small set of other numbers reserved for situations that had no other path through them, a direct line to the Special Operations Command watch floor at the Pentagon. 2 rings, and then Watch Officer Captain Hayes. Hayes. This is Commander Darius Reed. Authorization, Sierra Foxtrot. 779er Zulu. I am being held unlawfully at the Deer Lick County Sheriff's Station in West Texas. I have been assaulted, and my trident was removed with a knife during processing. A beat of silence, and then rapid keyboard input, and then, Commander Reed. We have you, sir. Good Lord. Are you injured? Negative. Arresting officer is Deputy Cole Hargrove, badge 214. I need this resolved. Sir, do not say another word to anyone in that building. I am escalating immediately, waking Admiral Whitmore right now. We are coming to get you. Darius set the phone in the cradle and turned to find Pete Lowe standing close enough to have heard every word, his face the color of old concrete, his hands very still at his sides. Who was that Lowe managed? Darius walked back toward the cell, and as he passed Lowe, he said in the same quiet and unhurried voice he had used for everything since pump number 4. That was the United States government, and they are very unhappy. He sat back on the metal bench and closed his eyes, and somewhere across town in Rosie's diner, the iced coffee was still cold in Hargrove's hand, and he was laughing at something, and neither of them knew yet which direction the morning was going to fall. At 11:47 that night, Rosa Garland was sitting alone in her closed diner with the lights off and the photograph still on her phone screen, and she thought about the last time she had reported something she had seen in this town, and the way the deputy had looked at her when she did, and the word troublemaker that had followed her for 6 months afterward. And she thought about the man in the uniform being pressed to the hot metal of the car hood, while the deputy grinned. And she thought about all the other times something like that had happened on the roads of this county, and nobody had a photograph, and her thumb moved to the share button, and this time it did not stop, and the image went out into the world at 11:47 p.m., on a Tuesday, and by morning it would be in places that no deputy in Deerlick County had ever imagined a photograph taken through a diner window could reach. Hargrove arrived at the station the next morning with a large iced coffee and the easy, unhurried manner of a man walking into a day. He has already decided will be uncomplicated, nodding at Doyle behind the booking desk, dropping into his chair with the comfortable weight of someone who slept well and woke up on time, and has no reason to believe the next 8 hours will offer him anything he isn't prepared to handle. He told Doyle about the guy, and holding the one in the Navy costume said the arraignment was this morning and the judge was going to have himself a real laugh before lunch. And Doyle looked up briefly and then looked back at his paperwork with the expression of someone who has processed enough people through this building to have learned not to ask questions about the ones Hargrove brought in. Pruitt arrived at 8, filling the doorway, the way large men do who have held power long enough that the architecture seems to arrange itself around them, carrying his coffee and a paper bag from the diner, nodding at the desk officers with the ease of a man moving through his own house. And the two of them went back to cell 3 together to collect Darius for the arraignment. Darius was doing one-armed push-ups when the door opened, the reps rhythmic and precise and completely unhurried, each one identical to the last, his body moving like a mechanism running a program rather than a man exerting effort. Not a trace of fatigue visible on his face, despite the heat and the hours and the metal bench and the broken cooling unit. And when he heard the door, he stood in a single fluid movement and clasped his hands behind his back, spine straight, and looked at them both with the patient and attentive expression of a man in complete command of the room he happens to be locked inside. Pruitt looked at him, at the posture, at the eyes, at the physical conditioning that was functional rather than decorative, and something cold and small planted itself in his gut without asking permission. A feeling he hadn't felt in this building in a very long time, the feeling of encountering something he had not adequately accounted for. Name, Pruitt said. Commander Darius Reed, United States Navy. Pruitt turned to Hargrove without changing his expression. Run his prints. Right now. The fingerprint scanner processed and beeped, and then the screen flashed red, and the warning dialogue that appeared in stark black text on white was something Hargrove had to read twice before the words arranged themselves into a meaning his brain was willing to accept. Warning, classified identity level 5. Clearance. Do not detain. Contact Department of Defense immediately. Hargrove read it a second time, and the iced coffee was very cold in his hand, and the words did not change. And then the red phone on Pruitt's desk began to ring. Not the public line, not the dispatch channel, not any of the ordinary phones that rang in this building with the regularity of a place going about its business. The emergency line, the one connecting directly to state police and federal agencies, the one that had sat in the corner of Pruitt's office for the entire duration of his tenure without making a sound, the phone that nobody called unless something had already gone significantly and irreversibly wrong. Everyone in the booking area looked at it, and the room went very quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when they understand that something is ending. And Darius tilted his head slightly and said in a voice that carried no satisfaction, only the accuracy of someone reporting a weather observation. "You should answer that, Sheriff." Pruitt crossed the room and picked up the receiver with a hand that was not completely steady, and brought it to his ear and said in the careful, measured voice of a man attempting to sound more certain than everything in his body is telling him he is Sheriff Pruitt. The voice that came back was female-controlled and carried the particular weight of someone who has not needed to raise her voice in a professional setting in a very long time, because she has simply never needed to. "Sheriff Pruitt, this is Admiral Grace Whitmore, Chief of Naval Operations. I understand you are currently holding Commander Darius Reed in your facility." Pruitt began to speak, and Admiral Whitmore told him 3 things. Commander Reed was a decorated Navy SEAL with 22 years of active service. He was a recipient of the Medal of Honor, and he was being held unlawfully in Pruitt's building. And then her voice dropped, and somehow dropping made it considerably worse than raising it would have, and she told him that he had 5 minutes after the call ended to release Commander Reed and return every piece of his property in the condition it was in when he arrived at the Buckhorn lot that morning, and that her sources indicated the uniform had been physically desecrated during processing, and that if there was a mark on that man placed there by his deputy, the United States Navy would not be merciful. Not to you, not to your department, not to anyone in that building who witnessed it and said nothing. The line went dead, and Pruitt set the phone down with the careful deliberation of a man placing something fragile on a surface that might not hold it, and turned to look at Hargrove, and his face had gone the color of old ash. "Unlock him," Pruitt said barely above a whisper. What Hargrove hadn't processed it yet, the iced coffee still in his hand. "Unlock him." The whisper didn't get louder, it got harder the way cold gets harder. Hargrove removed the handcuffs with hands that had misplaced their certainty, the keys fumbling once before finding the lock, and Darius rubbed his wrists and looked at Pruitt with the same expression he had worn since pump number 4, watchful patient giving nothing away for free. "Misunderstanding," Pruitt said, and the word sounded exactly as hollow as it was. "A mistake. Charges are dropped. You're free to go, Commander." "The charges against me are dropped," Darius said. "But the crimes committed in this building over the last 18 hours are only just beginning to come to light." Pruitt's posture stiffened, and something moved behind his eyes that was part anger, and part the specific fear of a man who has spent 30 years building a structure and is watching the first wall come down. "You walk out that door and we all forget this happened. Don't push your luck, Commander." Darius walked to the front window and looked out at the parking lot, and then turned back and pointed, and every person in that building looked. The parking lot of the Deer Lick County Sheriff's Department had acquired in the time since Pruitt's phone call had ended, and now 4 black SUVs with government plates parked at precise and practiced intervals across the lot, and 2 military police trucks in matte gray pulled up to the building's entrance and above the high school football field across the street, descending with the deep rhythmic authority that people who have heard it in their lives never entirely forget, a Black Hawk helicopter in dark gray that made every window in the station vibrate in its frame as it settled onto the grass with the calm inevitability of something that was never going to be stopped. Hargrove's iced coffee hit the floor. "They're already here," Darius said. The front doors of the Deer Lick County Sheriff's Station opened the way they open when the people coming through them have spent careers going through doors that other people didn't want. Opened, not kicked, not forced, simply entered with the quiet authority of individuals who understand that presence correctly deployed is usually sufficient to communicate everything that needs to be communicated. 2 military police officers in full tactical gear came through first hands near their holsters without touching them. their eyes running a rapid professional assessment of the room's geometry and its occupants in approximately 3 seconds. And behind them, 2 agents in dark suits, and behind the agents, Lieutenant Commander David Okafor of the Judge Advocate General's Corps silver at his temples, carrying a leather portfolio with the ease of someone who knows precisely what it contains and precisely what it does. Okafor scanned the room, booking desk Pruitt Hargrove, and then his eyes found Darius Reed standing by the window with the crumpled dress jacket folded over his forearm, and something shifted briefly in the professional detachment of his bearing, giving way to something more personal, and he stopped and his heels came together, and he rendered a sharp and precise salute. "Commander Reed, sir. JAG Corps. I'm here to relieve you of this situation." Darius returned it slowly. "At ease, David. You took your time. Traffic was murder, sir." One beat of deadpan silence, and then Okafor turned to face Pruitt, and whatever brief warmth had been in his expression disappeared entirely, replaced by something as welcoming as a federal warrant, and he opened the portfolio and set the first document on the booking desk with a sound that was small and final and landed in the room like a period. Okafor placed the federal warrant from the Western District of Texas on the booking desk, authorizing Darius's immediate release. The return of all his effects, the seizure of his rental vehicle, and the securing of every piece of physical and digital evidence related to his detention. And Pruitt tried the jurisdiction argument, the instinctive reach for the lever that had always worked before, and Okafor placed a second document beside the first without comment. Special Agent Carol Hines, who had been standing quietly at Okafor's left, with the stillness of someone accustomed to letting rooms settle before she speaks, stepped forward and explained in the level cadence of someone reciting established law to someone who is about to have a very consequential day. The handling of Darius's personal effects and the impounding of his vehicle had created a jurisdictional bridge that gave the federal government access to every piece of evidence in this building, physical, digital, and otherwise, going back as far as the investigation chose to reach, including the dashcam footage on Unit 7, Hines said, and looked at Hargrove. The effect was immediate. Hargrove took a half-step toward the corridor leading to the back offices, a small movement, possibly unconscious, possibly calculated, and it didn't matter which, because the 2 MPs moved before he had completed it. And in under 3 seconds, Deputy Cole Hargrove was pinned against the cinder block wall beside the booking desk with his arm wrenched precisely behind his back and his cheek against the wall in the angle of the hold, the pressure on the shoulder joint. The exact positioning of his feet against the floor was in its specific technical details essentially identical to the position in which Hargrove had placed Darius Reed at pump number 4 of the Buckhorn lot approximately 26 hours earlier. Okafor noted this aloud in the same dispassionate tone he might use to describe the weather outside. "Resisting federal agents. We'll add it to the list." Pruitt stood and watched his deputy get pinned to the wall of his own station, and understood with the particular clarity that arrives when something you have been successfully avoiding finally catches up with you that the walls had not been closing. They had already closed, and he had simply been standing inside them without knowing it. Hines set the tablet on the table and pressed play without preamble, and told them that Hargrove had attempted a remote deletion approximately 12 minutes before the team came through the front door, and that he had not known about the cloud backup, which was not an uncommon oversight among people whose confidence in their own invulnerability had led them to stop thinking carefully about technical details. The footage was from inside Hargrove's cruiser, the timestamp reading 7:39 a.m., the audio captured by the interior microphone with the flat and indifferent fidelity of a recording that knows nothing about discretion and cares nothing about who it exposes. In the footage, Hargrove was driving slowly down State Route 9 with his personal cell phone held low against the steering wheel, and his voice was easy and familiar when he said, "It's me, coming up on 9. Where's the tanker?" And the voice on the other end, slightly distorted by the phone's compression but entirely audible, said something about a late departure from the south 30 minutes out. "Hold the lot." And Hargrove said, "Copy. I'll do a pass. and the cruiser rolled slowly past the entrance to Buckhorn Feed and Fuel and through the windshield visible at pump number 4, a man in navy dress blues standing at a silver rental car. And then Hargrove's voice changed not dramatically, but in the specific way voices change, when a calculation is running underneath casual speech, the casual register giving way to something more operational. "Boss, we've got a problem. Federal uniform at the pumps. Navy dress blues. Looks like high brass standing right there." The voice on the other end quiet. "Is he looking at the tanker area?" "Not yet. But the tanker's going to roll right past him when it comes in. Then get him off the lot. Stolen valor, disorderly anything, just get a uniform out of that parking lot before the delivery gets there. You've got 20 minutes. A pause, and then Hargrove, casual and certain, the voice of a man who has been doing this long enough that it has stopped feeling like anything other than routine easy. "I'll handle it." The footage ended, and the room was completely quiet. "So it wasn't arrogance," Darius said without looking up from the tablet. He was clearing the zone. "Yes, sir," Hines said and swiped to the thermal satellite scan. Tanks 1 and 2 at the Buckhorn property showed standard gasoline consistent with the facility's registered capacity tank. 3 registered as inactive and pending decommissioning was not empty. The heat signature showed stacked rectangular objects consistent with compressed fentanyl packaging, moving northward in commercial quantities, and the tanker had been intercepted on Route 940 minutes after the federal convoy's approach caused the drivers to abort and flee, and its contents were currently being cataloged by a DEA field team, 12 miles East Street, value north of $2 million. "Hargrove has been running that lot as an operational surveillance post for at least 3 years, Hines said. Anyone who came through and presented as potentially federal Hargrove handled them. Exit interview." Darius looked at the thermal image for a long moment and then said, "The phone on the other end of that call." Hines pulled up a second screen. The burner number was a dead end on standard identification purchased in cash used exclusively for this call chain, but the phone that received Hargrove's call pinged off the cell tower on the roof of this building at 7:39 a.m. The signal radius covers 400 meters, and this tower covers one building. She looked through the glass partition at the sheriff's private office where Dale Pruitt was sitting with his head in his hands. "One building," she said. "We need a voice confirmation," Okafor said. "A capable defense attorney will argue audio distortion, phone compression. We need a human witness who was physically present for that call." "We have one," Darius said. "Lowe was in that car. He witnessed it," Hines said, looking at her notes, "which makes him a potential co-conspirator. He picked my trident up off the dirty floor and put it on the counter instead of leaving it where it landed," Darius said, and looked at Hines steadily. He knew what it was. He knew what it meant. He's not corrupt. He's frightened, and there's an important difference between those two things. Bring him in. Pete Lowe sat in the interrogation room without handcuffs, which in some ways made it harder, the absence of restraints leaving him with nothing to push against. Nothing to explain his position to himself with, except the fact that he was here because he had made choices. And choices had brought him to a gray room, knowing that the man he had watched be humiliated and cuffed the previous morning was somewhere on the other side of the door. He was 24 years old and looked closer to 17 in the harsh overhead light, and the paper cup of water in his hands trembled with a fine, continuous tremor he couldn't make himself stop. And when Darius entered and sat across from him, the silence lasted exactly as long as it needed to before Lowe broke it. He hadn't known the full picture when he started. He said, his voice cracking on the last word they had just told him to follow. Hargrove do what he was told. Keep his head down. The county takes care of its own, and he had known the tanker runs weren't normal, had known the phone calls weren't standard procedure, had known what the exit interviews were and what they cost the people on the receiving end. I told myself it wasn't my business yet, he said, and then his jaw tightened and he looked at the table. I'm telling myself a story, aren't I? Yes, Darius said without judgment. He laid out the two versions of the next 10 years, quiet and complicit, and 34 years old, coming out of a federal facility with the person he might have been already gone, or honest and intact, and walking out of this building today with something still worth keeping, and Lowe looked up, his eyes wet, and when he spoke, the words came out steadily, despite everything, with the particular clarity of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally made the decision to set it down. It was Pruitt. Sheriff Pruitt. I'd know that voice anywhere. I've been hearing it since my first week. I have dates. I kept a notebook because I was scared and I thought someday I'd need it. Tanker schedules names of people Hargrove ran out of town call times going back 8 months. He set the paper cup down carefully. I'll give you everything. Darius stood, and on his way to the door he rested his hand briefly on Lowe's shoulder, just a moment. Nothing said, and walked out. Darius opened the door without knocking, and stepped inside and stood in front of the desk, and Pruitt looked up from a cup of coffee that had been cold for an hour and a face that had shed in the course of a single morning everything it had spent 30 years building and maintaining. The football trophies were still on the shelf, the framed newspaper clipping still above the filing cabinet. Deer Lick County's own Dale Pruitt, elected sheriff by record margin, all of it still physically present, and none of it meaning a single thing anymore, the way the furniture in a burning house is still furniture, right up until it isn't. This is still my office, Pruitt said, and heard, even as the words came out, that it wasn't not in any sense that mattered. Darius set the tablet on the desk face up and stepped back, and Pruitt read Lowe's full testimony. The cell tower data, the dashcam transcript, with its timestamps and its voices, the thermal scan, the intercepted tanker manifest. 8 months of scheduling records written in careful, frightened handwriting in a notebook, kept by a 24-year-old who had been scared enough to document everything and decent enough to hand it over when the moment finally came. Pruitt read it all, and the color left his face in stages, not all at once, but incrementally, the way light leaves a landscape near the end of a day. The county was dying, Pruitt said at last, barely audible. People needed. There was nothing coming in, no money, no jobs, no future. I did what I had to. You didn't save this county, Darius said, and his voice was even and without cruelty, but without any softness either. You sold it. You sold poison to the people who trusted you with a badge and called it economic necessity. And when a soldier came through on his way to bury someone he loved, you used that same badge to try to destroy him because he was standing in the way of your delivery schedule, not out of necessity, out of reflex, because power like yours cannot tolerate witnesses. Pruitt said nothing. Agent Hines and her team came through the door, and Pruitt stood and turned and let the handcuffs close around his wrists without resistance, and he looked at Darius once, before Hines walked him out. And what lived in his face in that moment was not defiance and not calculation. It was shame, the specific and irreversible shame of a man who has for the first time in 30 years seen himself clearly and cannot now unsee it. Darius did not return the look. He walked out into the bullpen, and through the front windows in the hard, flat West Texas sun, Deer Lick County was watching its sheriff come out in chains. 3 days before the trial, Albert Vega Pop, to everyone who had known him longer than a week, sat at his kitchen table in the early morning with an old leather briefcase in front of him that he hadn't opened in 3 years. And the smell of coffee filled the small house and outside the window. The light was coming up over Deer Lick County the way it always had, indifferent to who was in trouble and who wasn't. He had owned Buckhorn Feed and Fuel for 34 years before Pruitt had made him an offer. He understood immediately was not actually an offer, and had reminded him with a quiet and absolute certainty that his grandson took the same route to school every morning, and Pop had stayed silent because he had believed Pruitt, and because silence had seemed like the only protection available to him, and because even inside the silence he had set a small digital recorder behind the invoice shelving in the back office and let it run during meetings, not because he had any plan to use what it captured, but because he needed something in the world to know that he knew this was wrong. He had seen the photograph the night it went up. His daughter had called and held her phone to his face, a man in a Medal of Honor uniform pressed to the hood of a car. a deputy smiling behind him, and something in Pop that had been very still for 3 years. Shifted not gradually, but with the finality of a structural thing that has been under load too long, and he had gone to the briefcase that same night, and now, 3 days later, he was sitting at the table with it open in front of him, a financial ledger and 11 audio recordings. And in the clearest of them, Dale Pruitt's voice, unhurried and specific, authorizing the killing of a state trooper who had gotten too close to the Route 9 corridor. Pop closed the briefcase and picked up his car keys. The federal courthouse in Houston occupied a full city block and had the gravity of a building that takes its function seriously. Stone-faced the federal seal above the entrance. The feel of a place where consequences are not theoretical but structural, built into every corridor and courtroom and deliberation room with the patient thoroughness of institutions that have been in the business of accountability for a very long time. The trial of the United States versus Hargrove and Pruitt had been national news since the photograph went viral. The image Rosa Garland had taken through her diner window and posted at 11:47 on a Tuesday night had moved across the country with the force of something that names a thing. People have been struggling to articulate the kind of photograph that doesn't require a caption, because the caption is already in the image, in the expression on the deputy's face, and the uniform on the man being pressed to the hood, and the gap between what those two things represent. In the gallery, Darius sat in his full-dress blues, the restored trident pin gleaming on his chest, the needle straightened with a pair of pliers in a Houston hotel room the night before the trial began. The small scratch where the knife blade had caught the gold still visible, if you knew exactly where to look. A fine, thin line that caught the light when the angle was right, and he had decided without fully articulating the reason not to have it repaired, because some marks are not damage. They are record. Hargrove and Pruitt sat at the defense table in orange jumpsuits, 30 years of authority and certainty stripped from them as completely as the uniforms they would never wear again. Gerald Marsh was the best defense attorney money could hire in the state of Texas. Precise, patient, cold, smiled the kind of man who had walked into considerably more difficult courtrooms than this one and walked out with verdicts that had left galleries speechless. And his approach to Darius on cross-examination was methodical and carefully constructed, building slowly toward the PTSD hypothesis. The portrait of a veteran compromised by battlefield trauma for whom authority figures were triggers, and dress uniforms were triggers, and a routine traffic stop in a West Texas parking lot had been processed through a mind shaped by Kunar Province into something it was never meant to be. It was exactly the wrong theory to deploy against Commander Darius Reed, and Marsh had no way of knowing that until it was too late to change direction. Darius sat in the witness box and listened to the entire construction of Marsh's argument with the patience of a man who has spent 2 decades waiting in circumstances that demanded it, and when Marsh finished, Darius addressed it plainly without theater in the voice he used when a thing needed to be said clearly and once. He had held his fire with a loaded weapon in situations that would make Marsh's worst professional day look unremarkable, he said. The decision not to harm Hargrove at pump number 4 was not a failure of restraint, but a demonstration of it. The choice a trained man makes when he understands that capability is not justification, and that the difference between a soldier and a bully is not a question of what each one can do, because both can cause harm, but of the deliberate and conscious daily decision about when not to. Marsh had no effective follow-up. He had handed the jury a definition and a living illustration of it, sitting 10 feet away in a Medal of Honor uniform, and the jury was paying very close attention. His final motion was to suppress the dashcam footage on procedural grounds, and the judge, a black woman with 30 years on the federal bench, and the expression of someone who has entirely exhausted her patience for arguments advanced in bad faith, was considering it when the back doors of the courtroom opened. The man who came through them was 67 years old, moving carefully with a wooden cane, wearing a suit that had been expensive in a previous decade, carrying a battered leather briefcase with both hands, and he walked with the careful and deliberate dignity of someone who has been frightened for a very long time, and has today for the first time decided to stop. Albert Vega. Pop placed his briefcase on the clerk's table and opened it, and the 11 recordings were entered into evidence, and in the clearest one, Dale Pruitt's voice was calm and specific and entirely recognizable, and what it said in that recording was not the voice of a man who had made desperate choices under economic pressure. It was the voice of a man who had been doing this so long that ordering a killing had become as unremarkable as ordering a delivery. The courtroom erupted, and Marsh sat down, and the motion to suppress the dashcam footage became irrelevant in the way that a single match becomes irrelevant when the building is already burning. Pop looked across the full courtroom toward Darius, and his eyes were wet with something that had been held back for 3 years, and Darius gave him one slow nod. "You came back. That's enough. That's everything." And Pop lifted one weathered hand in something that was almost a salute, and Darius held the nod until the old man's hand came down. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: racketeering, drug trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder assault on a federal officer, deprivation of rights under color of law. And the judge addressed each man with the gravity of someone who does not take pleasure in this part of the work, but understands with complete clarity why it exists and why it cannot be softened. Hargrove received 30 years for racketeering and trafficking, 28 consecutive for assault on a federal officer and civil rights violations, 58 years total eligible for parole consideration at age 96. Pruitt received life without the possibility of parole. Okafor informed Marsh with the professional courtesy of someone delivering information, rather than a verdict of the transfer arrangements. Both defendants had law enforcement backgrounds, and the Bureau of Prisons had determined that standard federal facilities presented unacceptable safety risks for former officers, and so both men would be transferred to the military disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, the administrative unit reserved for civilians who had committed crimes against the United States military, staffed entirely by military police, Marine Corps corrections officers, and Army personnel. Hargrove heard this and turned toward the railing where Darius stood, and Darius looked at him, and there was nothing in his face that could be called triumph or satisfaction. No relief, no release. Just the clear and steady accounting of a man who is closing a ledger on something that needed to be closed for a long time. "It's a hard facility," Deputy Darius said quietly enough that only Hargrove could hear it. "The guards wear the uniform you decided meant nothing every day for 58 years. Hargrove's legs gave way slightly as the bailiffs moved to lead him out, and the bailiffs held him up, and the heavy oak doors of the courtroom closed behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. And Darius stood at the railing and looked at the closed doors for a moment, and then turned and walked out into the corridor where the light was ordinary and the air was cool, and Raymond Cole was still waiting in Oak Ridge Cemetery for a visit that was finally 2 days overdue. The heat wave that had held West Texas in its grip for 3 months broke the morning Darius drove to Oak Ridge Cemetery, and the day was cool and clean in the particular way that days are clean after long heat finally releases the sky a pale washed-out blue, the air carrying mesquite and distance, the smell of something rinsed. He had the cemetery to himself in the early morning, and he walked the path from the map Cole's daughter had sent him, past the older stones, past the rows of white marble standing in the ordered and patient alignment that military cemeteries use to say something about the people lying in them. And he found it at the end of the third row from the fence a headstone still bright white against the older, more weathered gray of the stones surrounding it, the freshness of it startling in the morning light. Master Chief Petty Officer Raymond Cole, United States Navy SEAL. The only easy day was yesterday. Darius stood before it for a long time without moving, and the morning was very quiet around him. He reached into the breast pocket of his dress blues and took out the trident pin, the same one Hargrove had pried from his jacket with a pocket knife onto a dirty processing room floor, the same one Pete Lowe had picked up and placed on the counter, rather than leave in the dirt. The needle straightened with a pair of pliers in a Houston hotel room the night before the trial, the small scratch from the knife blade still there in the gold, still catching the light. Still there because some things you don't erase, and he knelt and pressed it into the soft earth at the base of the headstone, and it went in cleanly, the needle holding firm in the ground. "Sorry I was late, Chief," he said, and his voice was quiet and steady and entirely private. The voice of a man in a conversation that has been waiting a long time to happen. Ran into some trouble on the road. But I handled it the way you taught me. Didn't swing until I had the whole picture. Didn't waste the shot. Didn't leave until the job was done. He stood and brushed the earth from his knees and adjusted his cover, and he held the salute for 3 full seconds longer than regulation required, and then he turned and walked back to the car without looking back, because the war was over and the uniform was clean, and justice, though it had taken the long road through a West Texas parking lot and a concrete cell and a federal courthouse, had finally arrived. Cole Hargrove was processed into Fort Leavenworth on a Tuesday in November, and the guard who unlocked his unit was a young black Marine in a pressed uniform posture. Perfect eyes forward, going about his work with the quiet authority of someone who does not need anyone's acknowledgement to know exactly what he is. And Hargrove looked at him for one long second and then looked at the floor and did not look up again for a very long time. Pete Lowe completed his probation without incident and enrolled in a paralegal program at a community college in San Antonio the following spring, showing up every morning with the quiet seriousness of a person who has decided that the best possible use of what he now knows about the world is to make himself genuinely useful in it. Rosa Garland never deleted the photograph from her phone, and when people sometimes asked her why she had posted it that night after so many years of staying quiet, she would think for a moment and then say, "Only the last time I said nothing. Nothing changed. I wanted to find out what happened when someone did." The trident pin stayed in the earth at the base of Raymond Cole's headstone through the last of the summer heat and a thin Texas autumn and a brief pale winter. And the visitors who walked that path sometimes stopped when the morning light caught it just right, a small gold point against the white marble, warm and solid and specific, and stood for a moment wondering about it, about who had left it there, and what it meant, and what road had brought them to this quiet place without ever quite knowing the full story of the man who had pressed it into the ground with his own hands and walked away clean. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever watched someone misuse the power they were trusted with and felt that helpless, burning certainty that it was wrong, then you already know why justice, when it finally arrives, matters so deeply. It doesn't always come fast. It doesn't always come easy. But it comes. If you believe that, hit like and subscribe to our channel and drop a comment below. We read every single one.